What exactly is an MMO? When you first think about that question, you may come to an instantaneous answer. This game has X, Y, and Z, so it is an MMO. But if you take a moment to think about it further, the answer can become hard to come to. This is something that I have been thinking a lot about recently, and the true answers to this question are a bit interesting. And this entire idea or problem or whatever has come up recently from two major topics. The first is something that I guess you could call either game or community elitism. In short, the idea that people think their game is better than another's. And second, and more specifically, is the Release of Palia, which sparked some controversy with how it marketed itself as an MMO. If you have watched a lot of my videos, or if you take a moment to scroll through my YouTube channel really quickly, you can see that I make a lot of content for MMOs, specifically Guild Wars 2 and World of Warcraft, which these are two games that are very distinct from one another, but are fundamentally very similar. And the same can be said about a lot of other games, where two other MMOs that I see a lot of attention for right now are Final Fantasy XIV as well as The Elder Scrolls Online. The latter I wish I had played. Both of these games are very similar to both Guild Wars 2 and World of Warcraft, but are equally very different. But what do I mean by that vague language? Well, the difference can be quite obvious. There are different art directions, different lore and story, different developers, different communities, and so on. But the differences that are more important are the core gameplay elements. Guild Wars 2, for example, has covered a lot of different gameplay areas over the years, from hardcore competitive PvP to jumping puzzles to 10-player raiding, but the area that it has excelled at, focused most on, and is most well known for is its open world gameplay. Both a combination of the immense amount of exploration and single player content that a player can progress through, as well as massive groups of players fighting world bosses, conquering map-wide challenges, and so on. Comparatively, World of Warcraft is also a game that has dabbled in many pieces of content. Massive war zones to small group content to open world farming to increase your reputation with various factions, but the area of the game that it has excelled at most is its instance content. Both 5-player dungeons as well as larger raids, where dungeons and raids play an integral part of an average player's experience in World of Warcraft, and has a pretty massive impact on the gaming community at large, with the existence of the race to world first with the release of each new raid. So generally speaking, if a player enjoys a lot of open world content in video games, they will enjoy World of Warcraft a tiny bit, but will enjoy Guild Wars 2 a lot more. Whereas if a player enjoys instance content and progression more, they will enjoy Guild Wars 2 a decent amount, but will enjoy World of Warcraft a lot more. And of course, that does not take into consideration a massive amount of other factors that impact one's experience with one game, like the community, the classes and skills you can play as and use, the fact that World of Warcraft still has a subscription fee, and so on and so forth. But the similarities are pretty apparent, yet I feel like have become more controversial in the past year or so, where both games are MMORPGs, a specific subgenre of gaming that is basically a genre of itself, where MMOs are massively multiplayer online games, meaning games that host a large amount of players on a single server where you can interact with those other players in a variety of ways. And RPGs are role-playing games, which is an incredibly nuanced idea, but are generally games where an individual can take the role of a character in a fantasy setting and act in the world as that character. Like how in Guild Wars 2 and World of Warcraft, you can create a character and go do things in it, including being a major character in each game's story. Where MMORPGs are a unique blending of those two ideas, a world where you are playing as a character and interacting with that world while also doing that alongside many other people at the same time on an online server. Where MMORPGs are incredibly popular, and it is a very specific type of genre that there really aren't many other games that scratch a person's itch for an MMORPG's gameplay outside of an MMORPG. Yes, there are many games that have open worlds where you can do things in them, but an MMORPG's blend of the world and gameplay is so incredibly unique that I haven't seen any games that are exactly like Guild Wars 2 or World of Warcraft outside of MMORPGs. Additionally, MMORPGs and MMOs in general are incredibly unique. There aren't really any games outside of MMOs where you can interact with a very large amount of random people, otherwise they would be MMOs. Where that is all a lot of ideas that may be confusing, but let me lead you down a problem that arises from this that is going to become more relevant in a moment. Because of the unique nature of MMORPGs, people who want MMORPGs obviously want MMORPGs. They can like other games of course, but if they want to play an MMORPG, again, they want to play an MMORPG. And these games are very expensive to make, oftentimes fail, and are not very popular in the large gaming community as a whole. People discuss an idea of MMO popularity rising and falling over and over, where I think we are currently in a rise of popularity for the genre, which is nice, but we have recently been in a pretty large decline and will likely decline again soon. MMORPGs are, again, a very specific type of game. Many people like them, but likewise, many people don't like them, and this is obvious, but if people don't like them, people aren't going to play them, which decreases the total amount of people that can play an MMORPG, which decreases the total amount of profit that a development team can make off of an MMORPG. Where I listed 4 MMORPGs which I think are the biggest MMORPGs on the market right now, and they have another similarity between each of them, and it is that they are old. World of Warcraft released in 2004, Final Fantasy XIV released in 2010, Guild Wars 2 released in 2012, and Elder Scrolls Online released in 2014. The oldest is nearly 20 years old now, while the youngest is nearly 10 years old. These are old games where the combination of them having an immense amount of content while also having dated development concepts can be off-putting for some people, but they are also games that have stood the test of time so far. They are namesakes that people enjoy playing unless they have been playing the game for 15,000 hours and suddenly think the game is horrible even though they have played the game for 15,000 hours and are probably just burnt out or don't like the recent updates because of their own tastes. Where a lot of other MMORPGs have arisen over the years and fallen. WildStar was one of my favorite games, where it originally released in 2014, but I didn't play it until it went free to play. Where I didn't have much time to play it because it shut down in 2018, around 4 years after it released, and we can look at a lot of issues when it comes to WildStar, but it basically comes down to the game not being popular enough in the MMORPG community, where not enough profit was coming in for the developers, where MMORPGs cost a lot of money to develop and maintain, so the game was shut down. And we see that with many other MMORPGs. Where an additional issue with how we have had these 4 major MMORPGs for a long time now is that people are tired of them. I made a joke about someone having played the game for 15,000 hours, but a lot of people who are big fans of MMORPGs are just tired of the same old game they have been playing, which makes them hungry for new games. And there are many games that are on the horizon to release, and I don't mean this to sound pessimistic, but I'm willing to bet most of them will fail. But this brings forth one of the central ideas that I want to talk about in this video, and that is Palia, an MMO that was announced a while ago and recently released in open beta. A game that I have had a ton of fun with and quickly has become one of my favorite games, and a game that blends MMOs with another genre that I haven't talked about called cozy games. Or to quickly go over this idea, cozy games are basically games that are designed for unwinding and relaxing. There can be a lot of gameplay elements including challenging elements, but nothing really frustrating or competitive other than maybe one-off mini-games thrown into the game to spice things up. These games can range from farming sims like Stardew Valley to city building puzzles like Dorfromantik to many other ideas. Where Palia specifically is a social community simulator. There's a lot of stuff going on, but there's basically an open world where you can explore different areas, interact with different people, complete quests, gather resources, and build up your own instance plot. And the game marketed itself as an MMO, and I think it did that carefully. But I personally consider the game an MMORPG, but the game is very different compared to other MMORPGs like Guild Wars 2 and World of Warcraft, where considering it on the same level those games may be incorrect for some, but even considering the game an MMO was too much for a lot of people. Where this then brings back the idea of community or game elitism that I mentioned at the start of this video. Palia is by all means an MMO game, but many people disagree with that idea because of what their own personal view of MMOs are, where people think there have to be very specific gameplay elements in a game for it to be considered an MMO, and that any variation of that is basically offensive to them. And with the MMO climate being one of desperation for new games and content for a lot of people, a promising game not meeting their expectations was not a great experience for them. Where a lot of people were very upset with the release of Palia because it did not meet their own personal expectations of an MMO. Where I have noticed the game markets itself as an MMO a bit less than it used to because of the backlash, and it now really focuses on the idea of it being a community-based game, which is basically the same thing with different wording. But what are the elements of Palia that people were missing, and I guess what exactly are the elements of an MMO that makes a game an MMO? Where let's go down the path of solving what exactly an MMO is. The first idea we can tackle is the concept of an open world which may or may not have instances connected to it, where you can explore a world, tackle challenges, see cool places, meet people in it, and do other things attached to the open world. And a lot of people have ideas about how an open world should be structured, where there are many people who do not believe that Guild Wars 2 is an MMO game because it does not have seamless transitions between zones like World of Warcraft. Even though there are transitions between zones in World of Warcraft, it is just hidden in a different way compared to Guild Wars 2. Where when we look at Palia, it has an open world where you can do all those things, but it is similar to Guild Wars 2. The game is still pretty early on in development, at least to my understanding, so there are 2 zones. Each zone contains a large amount of content, NPCs, resource nodes, puzzles, and so on that you can interact with. You go to the next zone's entrance or use a fast travel method to teleport to the next zone, which is its completely own instance but is connected to the previous zone and lore. Where this is literally the exact same thing as Guild Wars 2 and is very similar to World of Warcraft but just a bit different. The second idea we can tackle is what constitutes MMO, where I think this is the start of the big issue that a lot of MMORPG players have with Palia, where Palia zones basically house 25 players, compared to Guild Wars 2 zones housing around 60 to 80 depending on the map, and World of Warcraft layers housing a couple hundred players. Or just like with the previous idea, many players don't consider Guild Wars 2 an MMO because it only houses 60 to 80 players in an instance compared to World of Warcraft, where World of Warcraft's number is just slightly bigger when you take all of the server-side infrastructure into account. But that idea is exasperated with Palia because the number is even smaller, where people think 25 players in a zone doesn't count as an MMO, where the technical definition of an MMO is an online video game which can be played by a very large number of people simultaneously, which this definition can be very vague because some people consider 10 people to be a large number of people, and that is how many people are in a Valorant lobby, and they are all playing simultaneously, where I think as we approach that 25 number, we are approaching a player count that is well above that of a single player co-op or multiplayer game. But I think the more important idea is that you aren't playing with just 25 people, you're playing with however many people are playing in your region as a whole. Sure, you may run around the world and find a bunch of people, but if you leave a zone and come back, you will likely be put into a new instance with new people. You go to another zone, there are new people, you can join a community and chat with people across multiple zones, and so on and so forth. There are a ton of people playing Palia alongside you at the same time, it just so happens to be that you can only see 24 other people at the same time, where that limitation exists because you don't want to be fighting over Cernuks or Copper Veins with 500 people all doing the same thing. The third idea is what gameplay an MMO houses, where if we look back to the original examples of an MMO that I explained, they all have similar gameplay. You hit enemies with sticks to get gold, armor, and experience in order to hit bigger enemies. Where to elaborate on that idea, there are progression systems where you gain power. There are gearing systems where you gain power, and there are enemies that are challenging, you have to fight, and may have to fight with others. Where Palia has gameplay that is more associated with cozy games, where there isn't a high level of competitive progression or gearing, your character progresses and you unlock better tools and you unlock new things, but it is a fundamentally different idea compared to other MMORPGs like World of Warcraft, where this then brings back the idea of the RPG elements of MMORPGs, where you play as a fantasy character in a world, where Palia is literally that. You're playing as a human that is basically, to summarize in a very crude way, brought back from the dead by a magical space god to interact with the various other races who make this world a home, and complete quests and explore temples and so on. It has those RPG elements, but the way you interact with the game is different compared to other MMORPGs. You're figuring your way through temples as you figure out puzzles and explore large areas. You aren't fighting monsters and then a big boss. And in the open world, instead of exploring new areas and gathering resources and interacting with other players and completing quests, you are doing exactly that, except you aren't fighting monsters along the way, and the total amount of players around you at one time may be smaller. Where when we look at the idea of MMOs, we can look at many other games besides the ones we have talked about. One that most people are probably familiar with is Club Penguin. This is kind of confusing, an MMO where you can interact with a ton of people at the same exact time and engage in different gameplay elements. By that definition, it is the exact same as World of Warcraft, but it is the setting of the game and the specific gameplay elements that differentiate Club Penguin from World of Warcraft and other MMORPGs like Guild Wars 2. Where in my opinion, and by definition, Palia is an MMO, but a lot of people disagree with that sentiment because of their own opinions about MMOs and how the gameplay of Palia is different than what they want in an MMO, which is obviously a very frustrating situation to be in. I would love to have another game that plays exactly like World of Warcraft Classic, for example, but there is not a single one in existence, and there will likely never be. Where let's get around to answering the questions. What exactly is an MMO, and by extension, an MMORPG? Well, every single person probably has a different answer to that question, where one's interests will skew their response one way or another. Some people are very specific with the definition that a game has to have X, Y, and Z to be considered an MMO, while others, like myself, are more relaxed with the definition. An MMO is a game where you can play in an online world with a large amount of random people. You can interact with them in a variety of ways through different gameplay elements. where an MMORPG takes those gameplay elements and puts them in more of a fantasy setting where you're playing as a character who is role-playing in a fantasy world that has been built by developers. From that definition, lots of games are MMOs and lots of games are MMORPGs. I love Guild Wars 2, World of Warcraft, and Palia. Each game is very, very different from one another, but are fundamentally very similar games from my point of view. Does that mean Club Penguin is basically the same type of game as World of Warcraft? Well, no. The gameplay elements are completely different, the gameplay is completely different, the setting is completely different, and so on and so on. But fundamentally, they are pretty much the same type of game. And those are all my thoughts on this topic. This video may be a bit controversial or rub some people the wrong way, but I would love to hear some people's thoughts down in the comments, specifically your own answer to the question about what you think an MMO is. I am very relaxed with my definition, but I know many people are a lot stricter and more passionate. If you enjoy my content, consider subscribing, and please take care of yourselves. Have a good one, everyone.